The wind cut across the wide-open plains, sharp as a knife, whistling through the slats of a weather-beaten fence that leaned like an old drunk against the horizon. The sky was a dull pewter, promising rain or perhaps something harsher. Though in this country promises often meant nothing. Jacob Caldwell, a man long past his youth but not yet swallowed by old age, stood on the porch of his lonely ranch house and scanned the trail with a squint. His hands were calloused, his beard ragged, and his heart, though hidden under a chest as broad as the land itself, carried an ache deeper than any scar on his body. He had sent away for a bride, just as men in the territories sometimes did, a woman to break the silence of his nights and perhaps mend the hollow years carved out by loss and solitude. He had not always been a loner. Once in another time, Jacob had dreamed of laughter around his hearth, of children running barefoot in the dust, of a woman's gentle touch smoothing the harsh edges of his days. But fate had different plans, stripping him first of his kin in a winter blizzard, then of his sweetheart when outlaws left her lifeless in a robbery gone bad. Since then, Jacob had built walls higher than the fences around his cattle. Still, as the seasons dragged on, even a man made of stone begins to feel the cracks. So he had written to an agency back east, laying bare his desire for companionship, and in return came a letter sealed with the faint scent of lavender. Her name was Margaret, and her words were kind, steady, filled with hope. For months he dreamed of her arrival. The stagecoach creaked over the ridge just before sundown, a dark silhouette against the fading light. Jacob's heart gave a rare kick in his chest, and he smoothed down the front of his dusty shirt as if he were a nervous boy instead of a hardened rancher. The driver cracked the reins. The horses snorted clouds of steam, and with a groan of brakes the coach lurched to a stop before his gate. Jacob stepped forward, each boot heavy with anticipation. But what stepped down from the coach was not one bride. It was two. The women held hands, their posture stiff as the eyes of every man on the coach line burned with curiosity and unease. Their dresses were plain, worn from travel, but their faces bore the pallor of determination. Most startling of all, they were conjoined at the side, bound together by flesh and fate. Jacob felt the breath leave his lungs. This was not the dream he had nursed through long nights. This was something else entirely, something no letter had warned him of. Margaret lifted her chin, her gray eyes locked on him with a fire that dared him to turn away. Beside her, the other woman, Eliza, softer in expression but no less proud, studied him with quiet fear. The coach driver muttered something about double trouble before snapping the reins and pulling away, leaving the three of them in a silence thick as storm clouds. Jacob's jaw tightened. Part of him wanted to demand answers, to shout his anger to the wide, uncaring land. But another part, the part that had grown weary of emptiness, told him to hold his tongue. The conjoined bride stood before him, vulnerable yet unbroken. Margaret's voice, steady as a hymn, broke the silence. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "I am the woman who answered your letter, but I could not come alone. Eliza is my sister. We are as one, for God made us this way. If you take me, you take her. If you turn us away, then we will face the wilderness together." Jacob felt the world shift under his boots. The rules he had known, about life, about marriage, about the order of things, seemed to tumble like a house of cards in a sudden wind. He stared at them, torn between anger, fear, and the ache that had driven him to seek a bride at all. The plains stretched endlessly behind him, the horizon merciless and vast. He knew the West did not forgive weakness. He also knew it sometimes demanded choices no man could prepare for. And so the loner rancher found himself standing on the threshold of a story larger than any he could have imagined. A story that would test his pride, his faith, and the very meaning of love itself. The first night was the hardest. Jacob had not invited them inside with words so much as with silence, stepping aside from his doorway and letting the two sisters cross the worn threshold. The small ranch house, built of rough pine and clay mortar, was hardly prepared for one woman, let alone two bound together. The single bed in the corner seemed suddenly inadequate, the narrow kitchen table too cramped. Jacob found himself pacing as they moved carefully about the room, their steps measured, their unity a reminder of the strange twist of fate now pressing itself into his life. As the fire burned low, Jacob sat in his chair, pipe in hand, staring at the flames while his mind wrestled itself into knots. He had imagined softness, a woman's touch on the walls of his loneliness, perhaps even children one day to carry his name. What stood before him now was something outside every dream and every plan. Margaret's voice from across the room broke through his brooding. "We will work hard," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for pity. We do not expect to be coddled. My sister and I have tilled earth, stitched garments, and survived harsher winters than this. If you allow us to stay, you will not regret it." Beside her, Eliza lowered her gaze but offered a small nod, her quietness speaking more of weariness than submission. The next day, Jacob hitched the wagon to take them into town. He had little choice. Supplies were running low, and it was only right the sisters be seen at the general store to take measure of their new life. But as the wagon rattled into Red Creek, whispers rose before the dust even settled. The townsfolk, hardened though they were by years of droughts, raids, and losses, still clung to their sense of order. They stared, some in shock, some in pity, and others with a curiosity sharp as knives. The blacksmith spat into the dirt, muttering about God's mistakes. The preacher's wife crossed herself as if warding off an ill omen. Children giggled before their mothers dragged them away. Margaret's spine stayed straight, her chin lifted with a pride that dared anyone to challenge her humanity. Eliza, however, shrank against her sister, her cheeks flushed crimson. Jacob walked between them and the stairs, his broad shoulders stiff, his jaw set like stone. He felt the weight of judgment pressing down, not only on the women but on himself as well. In the eyes of the town, he was the fool who had ordered a bride and ended up with a spectacle. The storekeeper, Mr. Davenport, cleared his throat as the three entered. "Supplies, Caldwell?" he asked with forced cheer, his eyes darting nervously toward the sisters. Jacob named what he needed. His voice clipped and the transaction passed with little warmth. But as they left, a young cowboy leaning on the hitching post called out, "Hey Caldwell, reckon you got 2 for 1? Maybe you'll share with the boys." Laughter followed, crude and sharp. Jacob's hand twitched toward his revolver before he caught himself. Violence would only feed the fire. Instead, he tipped his hat low and ushered the sisters into the wagon, though his blood burned hotter than the noonday sun. That night, back at the ranch, the storm broke. Jacob slammed the door harder than he meant to, and muttered curses about the cruelty of small men with smaller minds. Margaret turned on him, her eyes flashing. "And do you think we have not heard such words before? Do you think we have not been spat on, ridiculed, treated like beasts at a fairground? But we are still here, still breathing, still fighting. If you cannot bear the shame of us, then say so, and we will leave." Eliza, tears in her eyes, gripped her sister's hand and whispered, "Please, Margaret." But Jacob's anger faltered at the sight of them, strong yet so vulnerable, bound together by something beyond choice. He rubbed his temples, the fight draining out of him. "I didn't ask for this," he muttered, his voice low, almost broken. "I asked for a wife to keep me from going to my grave alone. What came was more than I reckoned on. I don't know if I have the strength." Margaret stepped closer, her voice softening, though her resolve remained. "Strength is not in the arms, Jacob Caldwell. It is in the heart. The land will test you. The neighbors will mock you. But if there is any part of you that still remembers how to love, then we may yet find a life worth living." Eliza added quietly, almost as if to herself, "We are not a curse. We are a chance. For you and for us." Outside, the wind howled through the canyon, rattling the shutters as if the wilderness itself echoed the turmoil inside. Jacob sat heavy in his chair, staring at the women who fate had delivered to his doorstep, his pride warred with his loneliness, his fear with his yearning. In that fragile silence, something unspoken began to take root. Not acceptance, not yet, but the faintest stirring of possibility. The first snow came early that year, thick and sudden, rolling out of the mountains like a white army bent on conquest. Jacob had seen winters bring men to their knees before, strong men, seasoned men. And when the first flakes touched his hat brim, he felt a chill crawl deeper than bone. The sisters had been on the ranch scarcely a fortnight, yet already the land was reminding them who held the real power. Jacob spent the day driving the cattle down from the high range, cursing the biting wind and the sky that grew darker by the hour. When at last he stumbled into the cabin, his coat crusted with frost, he found Margaret and Eliza huddled close by the fire, their sewing abandoned, their faces pale. "Storm's comin' hard," Jacob said, his voice roughened by cold and worry. Could last days. His words hung in the air like a sentence. The ranch house was sturdy, but the wind clawed at its seams, moaning through every crack. Wood would burn fast and food supplies were thin, for he had not expected to provide for 3 mouths this soon. Outside, the world was already disappearing in a whirl of white. Margaret stood, her expression as firm as the timbers of the cabin. Then we prepare, she said. Eliza and I have weathered storms before. But Jacob could see the shadow of fear in her eyes and in Eliza's trembling hands as she reached to stack kindling by the hearth. The storm did not care about pride or history. It came for all with the same ruthless hand. By nightfall, the wind screamed like a living thing. Snow slapped against the windows and the rafters shuddered with every gust. Jacob barred the door with a heavy beam and dragged sacks of grain to block the drafts. The three of them worked together. Their movements awkward but determined, a strange family forged in necessity. Still, as the hours dragged on, the cold pressed harder, creeping into fingers and toes, gnawing at breath and bone. It was then, in the depth of night, that Eliza faltered. Her face, always softer than Margaret's, had grown pale as parchment. Her lips trembled as she whispered, I cannot warm. Jacob felt a stab of alarm as Margaret gripped her sister tightly. Her own strength braced against Eliza's weakness. She is frail in the lungs, Margaret said through clenched teeth. It is why I would not leave her behind. Cold strikes her harder than most. Jacob, without hesitation, pulled more blankets from the chest, wrapping them around both women. But it was not enough. The cabin groaned under the storm's rage, and the fire was a hungry beast, devouring wood faster than they could feed it. Jacob cursed himself for not cutting more before the weather turned. He threw on his coat, ignoring Margaret's protest, and stepped into the howling dark. Every step was a battle. Snow blinded him, burned his skin, filled his boots. The axe was heavy in his frozen grip. Yet he swung it again and again, the sound of wood splitting swallowed by the roar of the wind. At last he staggered back inside, arms laden with logs, face raw and burning. Margaret rushed to help him, though her movements were hampered by the bond to her sister. Together they fed the flames, and warmth returned, if only in flickers. As Eliza stirred, murmuring weakly, Jacob knelt beside her. For the first time, his calloused hand brushed against her chilled cheek. You hold on, he said, his voice low but fierce. The West takes enough without taking you. Margaret watched him, her gaze unreadable, torn between gratitude and suspicion. The hours stretched into a cruel eternity. 3 figures pressed close by the fire, wrapped in blankets, listening to the storm tear at the world beyond their fragile walls. Margaret's head leaned just slightly against Jacob's shoulder, though her pride would never let her admit the comfort she took there. Eliza, half asleep, whispered words that neither of them could fully catch. Fragments of prayer or perhaps dreams of a gentler place. Jacob stared into the flames, feeling the strange weight of them against him. 2 lives bound together, thrust upon his own. For the first time since their arrival, he did not think of them as burden or mistake, but as something else, as something perilous perhaps, but also precious. When dawn finally broke, weak light bleeding through the frost-caked windows, the storm had spent itself. Drifts lay like frozen seas around the cabin, burying fences, swallowing paths. The silence was deep, absolute, a silence that felt almost holy after the night's fury. Jacob stepped to the door, looked upon the white ruin, and then back at the 2 women wrapped in quilts by the fire. Margaret met his eyes, tired but unyielding. We survived, she said simply. Jacob nodded, but inside, he felt something stirring that unsettled him more than the storm had. In that night of peril, their lives had braided together like threads in a single rope, and now, whether he willed it or not, he was bound to them. Not just by circumstance, but by something far deeper. The thaw came slow, the snow retreating in ragged patches that revealed the broken bones of the land beneath. Jacob worked dawn to dusk, mending fences snapped by drifts, digging out the cattle that had huddled half-starved against the wind. Through it all, Margaret and Eliza were there, moving as one, their hands raw from chopping wood, their backs bent over endless chores. Their presence in his home had shifted something unspoken. It was no longer Jacob's cabin alone, but a place where voices mingled, where laughter sometimes slipped past their weariness, where the silence of years had been broken. Yet along with that warmth came confusion. Jacob found himself watching them too closely. Margaret, with her fierce resolve, matched him. Blow for blow in stubbornness, a woman who could look the harsh West in the eye without flinching. Eliza, by contrast, was softer, her gaze tender, her words few but weighted with sincerity. Where Margaret challenged, Eliza soothed. Jacob felt caught in the pull of 2 currents, and though he told himself it was folly, they were sisters, inseparable. His heart refused the logic his mind demanded one evening. As the 3 of them shared a meal of beans and cornbread, Jacob caught himself staring at the way Eliza's fingers brushed lightly against the cup she held. Delicate and precise. Margaret noticed his gaze and stiffened, her jaw tightening. You'll not pity her, Margaret said suddenly, her voice low but edged with steel. Eliza is no frail doll. She is stronger than most who ever looked down on us. Jacob, startled, set his fork aside. I don't pity her, he said, his voice rough. I see her. I see both of you. Eliza's cheeks flushed and she lowered her eyes, but not before Jacob glimpsed a flicker of something there. Gratitude, perhaps, or something even more dangerous. But the world beyond their cabin walls had not forgotten them. Word had spread in town, carried on every tongue, twisted with each telling, the rancher Caldwell, who brought in freakish sisters as his brides. Some said he had gone mad with loneliness. Others whispered darker things, questioning what sort of life went on in that cabin far from the eyes of the righteous. It was only a matter of time before whispers turned to action. It began with missing cattle. Jacob found tracks leading off into the hills, bootprints mingled with hooves. Rustlers. He knew the signs well, but when he brought the news to Sheriff Allen, the man only shrugged, his eyes sliding away. Lot of folks say you've brought trouble on yourself, Caldwell. Maybe best you cut ties and send those women back where they came from. The words burned like acid in Jacob's chest. They're under my roof, Jacob growled, and I'll not cast them out for the comfort of cowards. But the sheriff only tipped his hat and muttered. Don't expect much help then. The rustlers struck again a week later. This time Jacob caught sight of them in the distance. 3 men on horseback, faces half hidden under hats, driving off a pair of his steers. His rage boiled hotter than a branding iron. He saddled his horse, rifle in hand, ready to ride them down. But as he reached for the door, Margaret blocked his path. You'll not go alone, she said firmly. You think we will sit idle while your anger leads you to a bullet? We are in this with you, Jacob Caldwell, whether you like it or not. For a moment their eyes locked, the air between them charged with something that was not only defiance. Jacob felt the old walls of his heart cracking wider, the weight of his solitude shifting into something new, something perilous. Eliza's hand rested lightly on her sister's arm, her eyes wide with worry as she whispered, Please don't leave us. We've lost too much already. Jacob hesitated, torn between the fury that drove him to reclaim his stolen cattle and the pull of the 2 women who, by fate's cruel hand, had become the center of his world. The West demanded strength, demanded action. But for the first time in years, Jacob wondered if strength meant something more than riding into the storm with a gun. Perhaps it meant standing, not alone, but with those who had been thrust into his life, even if it meant facing ridicule, danger, and the fire of temptation that burned hotter with every passing day. And so he lowered his rifle, if only for the night, the weight of choice pressing down heavier than any snowdrift. Margaret's lips pressed into a hard line, but her eyes softened, while Eliza exhaled a trembling sigh of relief. Jacob knew then that the battles ahead would not only be fought against rustlers and harsh winters, but against the far more dangerous war within his own heart. The night after Jacob lowered his rifle, sleep came in fitful scraps. The howling wind outside was nothing compared to the tempest inside his chest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the rustlers' shadowed faces driving his cattle into the hills, saw the smirk of the sheriff who would lift no hand to help him. Worse still, he felt the lingering press of Margaret's gaze and the soft tremor of Eliza's plea echoing through him. It was not the storm or the thieves that unsettled him most, but the way those women had bound themselves to his fate with words sharper than any iron shackle. When dawn cracked gray over the land, Jacob saddled his horse with grim resolve. He would not sit idle while his herd was carved away piece by piece. He would not let the whispers of Red Creek be proven true, that he had grown weak, distracted by his strange household. As he tightened the cinch, he felt a tug at his sleeve. Margaret stood there, her face pale but resolute, Eliza at her side with wide, fearful eyes. You cannot ride alone, Margaret said. Her tone was neither plea nor suggestion. It was command carved from the same stone as her pride. If you fall, we will be left with nothing. We will ride with you. Jacob's gut twisted. The thought of dragging them into danger felt like madness. Yet the fire in Margaret's eyes brooked no refusal. And Eliza, though trembling, nodded with a bravery that startled him. In the end, Jacob relented, seating them in the wagon and riding alongside on horseback. Thus they set out, 3 souls bound by more than blood or vow, heading toward the hills where smoke curled faintly against the sky. The rustlers' camp. They found it by noon, tucked into a ravine where the snow still clung in shaded patches. Jacob dismounted, rifle in hand, and crouched low behind a boulder. The sisters waited in the wagon, their hands clasped tight, watching him with hearts pounding in unison. Jacob counted 3 men just as he'd glimpsed before. Lean, hard-eyed riders with the look of vultures circling a carcass. His cattle huddled in a crude pen, lowing miserably. Jacob could have fired then, taken one man down in a clean shot. But the west was never clean. Instead, he stepped into the open, his rifle leveled, his voice carrying across the ravine. "You've got what's mine. Let 'em go and maybe I let you ride out." The rustlers laughed, a sound as cold as the snow around them. One. A scar-faced brute with teeth yellow as old ivory spat into the dirt. "Reckon you're in no position to bargain, Caldwell. Word in town is you're too busy playing house with freaks to guard your herd." His words cut deeper than the wind. Jacob's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could act, a voice rang out behind him. "Leave him be!" Margaret's cry split the air as she and Eliza stepped down from the wagon. Jacob's blood turned to ice. The sisters stood together, their figures defiant against the pale sky. Hands clasped, eyes blazing. Scarface's laughter grew harsher. "Well, looky there," he sneered. The stories were true. Caldwell's got himself a 2-headed bride. The other men joined in the laughter, cruel and mocking. Eliza flushed crimson, tears springing to her eyes, but Margaret raised her chin, proud as a queen before the gallows. Rage flooded Jacob, hotter than fire. He leveled his rifle and fired, the crack shattering the ravine stillness. One rustler dropped, clutching his arm with a howl. Chaos erupted. Bullets flew, ricocheting off stone, horses screaming, cattle bellowing in panic. Jacob dove behind cover, returning fire with deadly precision. The sisters, trapped in the open, clung to each other. Their cries carried on the smoke-tainted air. When the dust settled, 2 rustlers fled into the hills, their courage spent, leaving their wounded behind. Jacob approached Scarface, who groaned in the dirt, blood darkening his sleeve. "Tell the rest of your pack," Jacob growled, pressing the barrel of his rifle against the man's chest. "That Caldwell land ain't theirs for the taking, and if they come back, I'll not waste another warning shot." The rustler spat blood, but his eyes held fear. Jacob let him crawl away, limping into the wilderness. Silence fell again, broken only by the restless lowing of the cattle. Jacob turned to the sisters. Margaret stood tall, though her face was pale, while Eliza leaned heavily against her, shaken and trembling. "We told you we'd stand with you," Margaret said, her voice ragged but firm. "Do not forget it." Jacob's chest ached at the sight of them, fierce and fragile all at once, bound together not just by flesh but by the fire of survival. As they drove the cattle home, dusk painting the sky in bruised colors, Jacob felt the weight of what had passed settle on him. He had defended his land, but more than that, he had defended them, and in doing so crossed a line he could never step back from. These women were no longer guests in his cabin. They were the heart of his fight, the reason his blood still ran hot in his veins. But as he glanced at them, Margaret's steady gaze, Eliza's tear-streaked face, Jacob knew the real war was only beginning. Not against rustlers, nor against a town full of whispers, but against the impossible tangle of desire, duty, and fate that bound the 3 of them together tighter than any rope. Spring broke across the plains with reluctant beauty, the snow giving way to swollen rivers and tender shoots of green pushing through the soil. Jacob Caldwell's land had survived another winter, and with it so had he and the women fate had delivered to his door. Yet peace did not settle on the cabin. Peace never lingered long in the West. The rustlers had not forgotten their humiliation, nor had the town of Red Creek quieted its whispers. Jacob found himself met with narrowed eyes and half-muttered curses each time he drove his wagon to market. Men would lean in doorways, spitting tobacco juice into the dust, their meaning plain. Caldwell was no longer one of them. He had chosen his side, and it was not theirs. The sisters bore the weight differently. Margaret carried it like armor, her chin high, her voice sharp when provoked. Eliza carried it in silence. In the long glances she cast at Jacob when she thought he would not notice, in the way her laughter came less freely, Jacob felt torn in two by them. Margaret, whose fire matched his own stubborn will, and Eliza, whose gentleness seeped into the cracks of his hardened heart like spring rain softening stone. He knew he could never truly choose between them, for they were bound together, body and soul, yet his own heart betrayed him each time he lingered too long in Eliza's quiet smile, or in the clash of wills with Margaret that left him raw and alive in equal measure. Trouble came one evening as the sun sank, staining the horizon crimson. Riders approached, 6 in number, their faces grim beneath the brims of their hats. Scarface led them, his wound healed but his pride festering. Jacob met them at the gate, rifle in hand, his heart pounding like a war drum. The sisters stood just behind him, their hands clasped, their eyes steady though fear trembled in their chests. "You had your warning," Jacob said, his voice carrying across the yard. "Ride on and live. Stay and meet the dirt." Scarface spat, his grin wide and cruel. "We ain't come for your cattle, Caldwell. We come for you. And them." His gaze slid toward the sisters, lingering with vile curiosity. "Town don't want you no more. Best we end it here." The world shrank to the beat of Jacob's heart. He fired first, the shot cracking the silence, dropping one rider clean from his saddle. Chaos erupted. Bullets tore through the twilight, the air thick with smoke and the shrieks of terrified horses. Jacob fought like a man possessed, his rifle spitting flame, his fists rising when the bullets ran dry. But even the strongest man cannot hold against 6. A shot tore through Jacob's shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Margaret cried out, dragging Eliza forward as they rushed to shield him with their own bodies. Scarface dismounted, pistol raised, his shadow looming long in the dust. "Guess the loner rancher dies with his circus," he sneered. It was then that Eliza, the quiet one, the one overlooked, found her voice. Her hand darted to Jacob's fallen rifle, her slight frame shaking as she lifted it. Scarface laughed, stepping closer. But the laughter died when the crack of the shot split the air. The bullet struck true and Scarface staggered back, eyes wide with shock before collapsing into the